Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at the museum today. My name is Stephen Fagan. I'm the curator, and this is a living history conversation. It's an extension of our ongoing oral history project at the museum that's recorded more than 2,500 interviews with people from around the world, recalling their memories of President Kennedy and the 1960s. And you're in for a real treat today because of our special exhibit, 2 Days in Texas, which chronicles the last 2 days of President Kennedy's life as he made this whirlwind political tour of Texas. We're inviting special guests, one each month, who encountered President Kennedy or were connected in some way to that fateful trip to Texas. We've had several people come who were here in Dallas at the time or in Fort Worth. In fact, one of our guests, Jan Siddle, is here in the audience. Jan was out at Love Field. You can see the sign that Jan carried to welcome President and Mrs. Kennedy to Dallas. You can see that on display in the gallery over there. We appreciate you being here. But this is actually the very first time we've ever had a guest speaker who was at the first stop on the trip to Texas, San Antonio, which you can see right over there, stop number 1. I'm joined today by Dr. Lee Alvoid, who was a high school student at the time, and she's going to tell us her remarkable story about seeing President Kennedy at Brooks Air Force Base on November 21st, 1963. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alvoid to share her story. We're going to start today by showing folks what you looked like around this time, 60 years ago. I know that putting a yearbook photo on the big screen is probably the stuff of nightmares, but you're lovely in this picture. We're so happy. Lee, let's go back to the early 1960s. 1960, John F. Kennedy was running for president against Richard Nixon. You're a San Antonio native. What was it like being a kid at that time during the 1960 campaign?
I didn't actually see him when he was there, and I was fairly young then. I was 15 when I did the press conference with him, so I was pretty young then. And my parents were not fans of President Kennedy, but San Antonio was very supportive of his political career, largely because of the large Catholic population. And while that was a point of controversy through his whole tenure as president and through his campaigns, that was a point of celebration in my hometown. We watched the campaign very closely, and because I was sneaking into journalism as an area of interest, I was maybe a little bit more engaged in looking at those things. But then again, I was like 12.
Right. There was a San Antonio chapter of what was called the Viva Kennedy clubs, which was this grassroots effort to get the Hispanic vote out for President Kennedy. You remember Viva Kennedy?
I remember things about it. It was interesting to grow up in San Antonio because it was always a majority-minority city. And while the power was somewhat centered in Anglo political leaders, there was always the potential for a high Hispanic vote and engagement there. And so, as my recollection goes, that was some of the earlier times to try to mobilize that population into being active voters and active participants in the political process.
That's right. Mrs. Kennedy did the very first Spanish language presidential campaign commercial in 1960, and I'm sure that aired in the San Antonio market.
Right. But y'all, I was so poor, we didn't have a TV till I was a junior in high school. So my life was radio and audio. So I probably didn't see that commercial. I might have heard that commercial.
Well, President Kennedy, when he was running in 1960, he did visit San Antonio, visited the Alamo. You didn't see him on that occasion, but when he made this triumphant return to the city in the fall of 1963 to kick off his re-election campaign, you were part of that experience. We have some pictures here. The President and Mrs. Kennedy, they arrived at San Antonio International Airport. We have to remember this was a quick visit. They were only in San Antonio for about 2.5 hours. And so they landed at the airport and then took a motorcade through San Antonio. I believe Broadway was the main street they went down. And you can see some really enthusiastic young people chasing after the motorcade. Now, Lee, here in Dallas, the next day, November 22nd, the DISD allowed students to miss school with an excused absence as long as they had parental permission to go see the presidential parade. Was it like that in San Antonio the day before?
Yes, I think they were excused. Not everybody took advantage of that, but it was, obviously there's a lot of teenagers running around down that street.
There is. It was estimated there were about 125,000 people out there in San Antonio just along that motorcade route to Brooks Air Force Base, which is where you were. We can't find you in this crowd, but you're out there somewhere. You mentioned a moment ago that you were interested in journalism. Tell us how your interest in journalism plays a part in you being able to be at Brooks that day.
That happened to be what I gravitated toward in high school. I was in drill team also, but luckily it was when you didn't have to get your leg over your head to be in drill team. We did rope tricks. We were the lassos. And I can still do that. I still have my rope. But journalism was an outlet because it was the old days with the developing your own film, you know, the old style cameras. It was a very big activity to be in high school. We had our newspaper was, of course, Thomas Jefferson. We were the Declaration, and I brought my yearbook with the pictures that we took at the press conference. It's, of course, the Monticello. So everything was sort of Jeffersonian. And I worked on both the yearbook and the newspaper. We were a 3-year high school. Back then it was the old junior high days, so 9th grade was in the junior high. And I was a junior when I was able to participate in the Kennedy visit.
And so how did that happen? Certain schools in San Antonio, in the metro area, were invited to Brooks, right?
As I recall, it was sort of a last-minute thing they added to his trip in San Antonio. That's often the case with presidential visits. The front team he'll decide he wanted to do something, they'll add something in. So we didn't have a whole lot of prep time. And I think he did stick to San Antonio ISD proper to invite the students to come to the press conference. And if you know anything about San Antonio, there's a lot of school districts within the city limits of San Antonio. But I think we were allowed 3 students to attend, and he was going to hold a press conference for high school journalists right after his main press conference, after his speech at Brooks. And so I was one of the ones that was selected to go. We took a photographer and one other student. We were the only team that took a photographer, which got us some perks I'll tell you about in a minute.
Yeah. Let's talk for a minute just about Brooks, because that was one of, I think, 5 different air bases at that
5
time.
different military institutions, so installations in San Antonio. So I grew up in a military environment, and there were good things and bad things about that, because we were also a target when there was unrest internationally. Brooke was those buildings that he was there to dedicate were fairly new. And it's sort of about the space race too, because it was a new institution to look at the medical treatment of people who were going to travel in space or any kind of space involvement. So that was the purpose of that airfield, was to look at medical issues in the airspace business. I was telling Steve it was closed in 2011 when they realigned a lot of the military bases, and so now there are only 3 institutions in San Antonio. People get it confused with Brooke Army Medical, which is the big medical with the burn center that you hear about a lot in the news currently. That's still there. This one is now this multi-purpose development with restaurants and entertainment venues, and the only building hangar that's still left is a wedding event venue place, and the building where he did his speech is like the reception area for the whole development. So it's no longer an active military institution.
And the street that runs through there is named in memory of John F. Kennedy.
After the speech he made. That building 150, they call it, is on Kennedy Street as you enter that whole new development.
So you mentioned there were 5 military installations growing up when you were growing up in San Antonio. So during the 50s, at the height of the Cold War, you guys didn't do exactly duck and cover drills in school. You did like citywide drills.
This is pretty hilarious. Think about the implications for safety now and all the precautions. In elementary school, instead of doing the duck and cover kind of things when there was any kind of fear of a military attack in San Antonio, moms didn't work as much. So we would get into some random mom's car. They would show up at the school. We'd all evacuate the building, go into a cart, and they would drive us really far out of the outskirts of town away from the military base. And we'd stay for about an hour or so. And then they'd drive us back to school. And that's how we did duck and cover for bomb things when I was a kid. No seat belts, no, it was some mom you didn't even know. You just get in the car, you get into car number 60, and there you go off. And this was like first grade through fifth grade. Kids piled into those cars.
Brooks wasn't normally open to civilians. Was this the first time you had been to Brooks Air Force Base?
Yes, and they kept it a little more closed because it was a research facility. And the aerospace industry that whole space race thing was a part of my youth also, because Sputnik had just happened in 57. And I was in elementary school then. So it was pretty guarded because there was still a lot of competition in the space race, and Russia loomed, as it does today, as a threat and a competitor. And so that was not a base that was open for visitors very often because it was a research facility. Just impact from the space race on my high school days, with the push towards adding more math science to advanced placement programs, and they had a thing called PSSC physics. Some of you will remember that. They were trying to push women to go into a different format of teaching physics because we were trying to become more competitive with Russia at that time. I was a journalism girl, so I wasn't in PSSC physics. I was more in the history English realm of things.
I completely understand. So, John F. Kennedy, you're out there, you get a chance to see the youngest man ever elected president. In person, did he look the same as he looked in Life magazine and on black and white TV?
Yes, very handsome and very charming and articulate. And he had a penchant. If you look at the exhibit around the museum in this room, you'll see he often stopped the motorcade to talk to kids. He was very interested in talking to young people. And so that's, I guess, why they did the high school press conference. And she was amazing just to look at. But also, we were able to interact with her a good bit more than some of the other groups that came. Because we had that photographer, they put us in the front of the high school kids that were doing the press conference. And then when she walked to the limo, which was actually the limo where he was killed, we were able to walk with her to the limo and interact informally with her. And she would ask questions about what we were interested in and where we wanted to go to school, things about our future. So they were very personable and drop-dead gorgeous as a couple, and just drop-dead gorgeous.
Before that student press conference, Kennedy spoke for about 9 minutes, dedicating the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks. You see a picture of him standing at the podium there, and for those of you in the gallery today, that podium right back there is a replica of the one used at Brooks. It was built by the base carpenter there at Brooks Air Force Base, custom built for President Kennedy's appearance on November 21st. The original podium still exists. It's at the Whitty Museum in San Antonio, and the Whitty very kindly sent us the dimensions so that we were able to replicate that podium. So be sure to get a picture at that podium today so you can replicate what President Kennedy is doing there on November 21st at Brooks Air Force Base. There's actually no sound film of President Kennedy speaking that day. What we have is an audio track of his speech at Brooks, as well as silent color footage. So what we've done is I put together like about a 90-second clip of Kennedy speaking to give us a sense of what it was like to be there the day before the assassination as he dedicates this building at Brooks. So we're going to take a look at this. We married the silent footage to the existing audio from the Kennedy Library.
From Brooks Air Force Base, Texas, November 21st, 1963.
More than 3 years, I've spoken about the new frontier. This is not a partisan term, and it's not the exclusive property of Republicans or Democrats. It refers instead to this nation's place in history, to the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity, an era to be characterized by achievement and by challenge. It is an era which calls for action, and for the best efforts of all those who would test the unknown and the uncertain in every phase of human endeavor. It is a time for pathfinders and pioneers. I have come to Texas today to salute an outstanding group of pioneers, the men who manned the Brooks Air Force Base School of Aerospace Medicine and the Aerospace Medical Center. It is fitting that San Antonio should be the site of this center and this school as we gather to dedicate this complex of buildings. For this city has long been the home of the pioneers in the air. And in the new frontier of outer space, history is being made every day by the men and women of the Aerospace Medical Center, without whom there could be no history.
Stirring, optimistic words from the president. So poignant, of course, considering what happened the very next day here in Dallas. So after that speech dedicating that building at Brooks, as you mentioned, the press conference, the special student press conference, and you had a photographer there. And one of those pictures got published in the yearbook, and we're going to take a look at that real quick. Kind of a strange picture of President Kennedy, a facial expression you don't often see, but such a unique picture. You guys are really the first ones outside of the students of Thomas Jefferson High School in San Antonio to see this picture. And we have the little caption that appeared in the yearbook it says that the Jefferson High School photographer captured the vibrant aliveness of his bronzed face and the surprise of his sun-bleached hair. Lee, did you write that?
No, I don't think I wrote that. I don't remember if I did, but it's pretty good. I should claim it.
So what kind of questions did those high school students ask of President Kennedy?
As I said, we didn't have a whole lot of prep time. I think it was an event they threw in, his advanced team threw in, just because he liked talking to kids. But we asked about, because the Vietnam War was pending, there was so much tension, the Cuban Missile Crisis had happened, and we were subject to the draft, my generation. We asked about military service, we asked about the draft, we asked about funding for college. College loans were still an issue back then. We asked about there was so much unrest with the Cold War. We asked about how safe we were living in a military town. We asked questions like that. And then probably some silly kid questions about his family and what she was wearing, things like that are just typical high school kids. Remember, this is the 15-year-old me recalling all of this, which is, I've obviously slept since then.
You've told me in the past that this was a very inspirational moment for you in terms of learning to take advantage of what opportunities you have in life. Can you talk about that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think mentors are important, and that journalism teacher was such a strong mentor that she jumped on that right away, and then I was lucky enough, fortunate enough for her to select me to go. And going, we were excited, of course, to interview the President of the United States, and he was a popular president in my town. But when you look at the context of the next day, the significance of being selected and being able to be there and interact with them, and then having that even more intimate conversation with them going to the limo, strikes me as maybe a challenge to the young people in the audience to always take advantage of opportunities that even seem daunting or scary or that you don't think you're ready for. Because when you take advantage of opportunities like that, it can be very life-changing, and it can be a story that shapes other decisions you make in your life about whether you want to venture out, try something different, put yourself out there, and then always thanking the mentor who selected you, who helped you get there, who helped you process what happened when you got back.
Let's talk for a moment about that next day, Friday, November 22nd. It was a Friday at school. There was going to be a pep rally that afternoon. Where were you when you heard the news from Dallas?
Well, this is another mentor, interesting, serendipitous thing. My life is full of serendipity, I think. My very favorite teacher, other than the journalism teacher who was wonderful, his name was Calvin Hines, and he was a history teacher, had a military background, and I was in his class when they made the announcement that President Kennedy had been assassinated. And he stood in the doorway. Of course, my friends that are here know I cry at Roach Motel commercials, so I was like sobbing hysterically because we had just seen them the day before. But he stood in that doorway and cried because he was still in the reserves, the Air Force reserves. And he said, "I will be in a fighter plane the next 3 days because we are subject to an attack while the government's destabilized." And until, of course, they had to swear in LBJ, they had to get back to Washington. So all military towns or vulnerable bases where I lived were subject to an attack. And we were in the Cold War. We'd already had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We'd already had, a lot of interactions with Russia that were not in our favor, or that were threatening. And I just remember that moment so much because it was, again, a context that added to the experience the day before of someone else who was really important in my educational life, experiencing the pain and the fear and the trepidation of what might happen to our country because of this assassination. And we stayed in that room. They didn't release us. It was like there were aspects those next few days of 9/11 to me, those of you that are younger, because everything shut down. Everything shut down. The airspace, because, again, we were a vulnerable target. And just the weight of what had happened really made the day before seem like an even greater opportunity that I was blessed with as a student.
What stands out from the rest of that weekend? Lee Harvey Oswald arrested here in Dallas, shot on Sunday, funeral on Monday. What was it like as a high school student to absorb all of that on television?
Well, it was just like one thing after, it's like, how could this be happening kind of thing. And, I'd have to go to a neighbor's house to watch TV, but just hearing it on the news, hearing the stories about it, then the wondering, why did he shoot Lee Harvey Oswald? Why? And so kind of the beginnings of worries about greater plans and conspiracy theories, and that this museum plays such a great role in having all the documents that they have, because conspiracy theories persist about this assassination today. But just like, this is unbelievable, what's coming next, who else is going to be killed as a result of this big interruption in our leadership. And
remarkably, you found yourself right here in Dealey Plaza at the site of the assassination just a week or two afterwards, right?
Right. We, Texas Women's University used to have a Texas High School Press Association conference always in the first or second weekend in December. And we brought a team up. We had a whole bus full of kids because my school is big. We had 1,000 in my graduating class. It was a big school. And so and it was a competition. You'd submit stories for critique. And on the way home, they decided to stop at Dealey Plaza so we could see the site of the assassination and look at the 6th floor, look at all of that. Well, there was a sea of floral arrangements, just huge sea of flowers, and lots of people there taking pictures, not with their cell phones, but they're not. And I remember just, of course, sobbing again, but getting really angry at the picture taking. I'm not sure why that hit me, but it seemed like a desecration of something that should be dealt with in a, they weren't doing selfies, but they were posing with the flowers where this man was killed. And I just remember feeling a lot of anger over not only the assassination, but people's response to it as if it were some sort of a party atmosphere. It would be like today if you went to a funeral and somebody took a picture with their cell phone, a selfie with the casket. That's how extreme it felt to me. Hope none of y'all have done that. But
You actually confronted someone, right?
oh yeah, I went up. Stop taking pictures. This is a site that should be honored. I was like this feisty little 15-year-old confronting all these adults with their old Nikon cameras, taking pictures because I was so angry about it. I've never been one not to mince for words.
We've been looking at other pictures published in that yearbook showing the reaction at your school after the assassination. Let's talk for a moment now about what came after, the rest of that 60s experience. You went to the University of Texas at Austin at a really remarkable time, I think, 65 to 69. And you mentioned to me that you started off being in the Young Republicans,
right.
And by the end of your time at UT, you had become a Vietnam War protester. Tell us a little bit about your 60s experience and how it plays into this story.
Such an era of rapid change. When I first went to UT, you had to wear hose, closed-toed shoes, and dresses on campus. By the time I graduated, people weren't wearing anything. But that tension of that era was so much around the people who had to go and fight. And how many of my colleagues, when I looked at high school graduation, reunion, paperwork for years after that, hundreds and hundreds of my classmates were killed in that war. And so you became more and more, I remember a guy getting kicked out of my Shakespeare class because he didn't prepare for class, and he had to go into the draft because he was on scholastic probation. And we never saw him again. So the heightened tension there made me, my parents were extremely conservative, and just being in that other environment and then being in those times kind of flipped me over to being much more of a, looking at humanity, looking at the cost of war, looking at the importance of peace. My first really assertive adult act was, I had a philosophy professor who was the faculty sponsor of the SDS, and those of you that are older will know SDS. It was a communist organization, student communist organization. And they fired him because he was a communist. He never mentioned any of that in class. He was just a great, great professor. So I volunteered to go before the Board of Regents of the University of Texas to testify on his behalf. He got fired anyway, but I remember that was like, he didn't try to corrupt us. He didn't try to influence us. He was a really tough professor. So, it was such a time of turbulence and change. The assassination era kept going. In my recollection, Medgar Evers, prior to JFK's, Martin Luther King, RFK, the last one that was real acted upon was really the Reagan one. But I worry now, again, bringing that era to worrying about the present, is that we're kind of ripe for that again, with the discontent in the country, the proliferation of guns, the threats, all directions. So I worry we're going to enter into another era of that. So again, my caution is always pay attention to history, because it does repeat itself if you don't pay attention to it. And pay attention to the context of what's going on around you, because that's somewhat why my behavior and activities changed in the 60s, was I paid attention to the context of what I was living in and what was going on around me, that then shaped my actions and beliefs and stands for what I thought was right.
I do want to mention that UT was really ground zero for some of that change. While you were at UT, August 1st, I believe, 1966 was when Charles Whitman carried out the greatest mass shooting in American history up to that time, and would be for another 20 years, when he killed, I think, 15 people that day, firing from the UT Tower. How did things change? Your sister was on campus that day,
she
correct?
was on campus, and this was pre-cell phone era, guys. We couldn't get hold of her. So you couldn't, and the news wasn't as fast as it was, so we didn't know where she was. I was working my summer job in San Antonio, and we were like as a family in a panic till she was actually locked down in a store on the drag. So she could have been a victim because she was on the main drag. That was a really changing, life-changing kind of thing, and a fearful thing for our family. And like you say, the beginning of a series of incredible things that happen with mass shootings in our country, and that persists to today. So
we're here at this site 60 years after the assassination. Lee, you spent more than 30 years in education. You were chair of the education department at Southern Methodist University for a number of years. That's when you and I first met. When we look at a subject like this that is slipping rapidly from memory into history, how do we keep something like this relevant to young people? We were looking at a lot of the young people here visiting the site today. As an educator, how do we maintain that connection from past to present, you think?
Well, I think you have to make direct connections for people. I think you have to really point out what happened then and what's going on now and what the possibilities are that might happen in the future. And I've already spoken about the potential assassination. I think looking at my short career in journalism, because I did switch to education, I think you have to look at journalism and how it's evolved, because I think that's how we get our information. And I was so strictly trained to have my headline match the content of the story and be brief. We just got chastised. I worked on the Daily Texan, and we just got beat up if our stuff wasn't, if you couldn't back it up with verifiable sources. They would check your sources. They would check that. All of that had to be so precise. And you look at a headline today, and it often has nothing to do with the story, but it catches your eye when you're scrolling along, and you may or may not read the story, and then they get their message across because you read the story because it doesn't match the headline. So I think skepticism, one of my specialties in teaching English to young people was critical thinking and critical reading. And I don't know how they do that now because verifying sources, I mean, we went so deep with middle school kids, when I worked with middle school kids, to say, don't just find out the source of the information, find out who's funding it. You know, look, so we were teaching these young kids to dig and dig and dig before they quoted something. And I think that's another caution I have from then to now. It might be kind of a fun way to engage kids to look deeper into something that they're working on in school, to see what's the real story, what's the real backstory, what's the real reason why this is being explained this way. Because I think journalism is one that has really changed. And I think letting people know to be prepared for change and how fast it happens. You know, like that 60s era was definitely rapid change. But I even go back to the aerospace industry. You know, we had Sputnik. We've got so many satellites floating around up there now. And most of that industry is privatized in partnership with NASA. So things that seem like our biggest passion as a nation can rapidly change into something that becomes commercialized and improved in some ways and not improved in some ways. So I think just if we could prepare kids to be ready for change and to know that what they like the very best that's going on right now could be gone at any time, and to enjoy the context of what you're in right now, but know that always be thinking futuristically about what might happen, both good or bad, with what's going on.
Rather than do a formal Q&A, if you have questions for Dr. Alvoid, you're welcome to come up and chat with her for a few minutes after the program today. Please join me in thanking her for sharing this remarkable story.
Oh.